Hey, I'm Eric Rokeach with FitnessBusinessInterviews.com, and I'm here with the achievement mentor himself, Mr. Tom Terwilliger. And Tom is a #1 best-selling author. He's an international speaker and, of course, a former Mr. America, which is pretty cool, by the way, Tom. And he's also been really cool enough to come on here today and share his incredible story about how he was able to overcome a badass biker, drug abuse, alcohol-filled world to becoming a national bodybuilder and ultimately becoming the leading authority on the science of achievement. And what this interview with Tom is going to do for you is it's basically going to motivate the hell out of you. And I'm going to have him come in here and share all these awesome tips about his story and what you can do to step up your game so you have your life and your business to the next level. So Tom, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, I got to tell you, Eric, it's always a pleasure. It's great to have an opportunity to share whatever wisdom I've gained over the last 30 years or so in the fitness industry, in business, and having made some life changes along the way, because I know for a lot of us, it's about changing our lives. It's about bettering our lives. It's about having that opportunity to take it to the next level, you might say, whether it's with our wealth or our health or relationships. So, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. So there's no point having knowledge if you're just going to keep it to yourself. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to share my experiences, and thank audience members for taking the time to listen, because it says a lot about you, by the way. Sitting down, most people would rather be out having a cup of coffee or watching TV. Instead, you're doing something that's going to continue to educate you and hopefully motivate and inspire you to take it to the next level yourself. So congratulations just for being here.
Very cool. Great point, by the way. You've been able to get to this point in your life where you're helping hundreds of thousands of people, but it always had, it wasn't always that way. So what I want to know is I want to take a step back to the early days, and the first thing I want to do, kind of want to set the stage. I kind of want to just dive into how things were for you in your life growing up when you were young.
It's interesting you should ask that, because it's something that I had been very reluctant to share with people, my experience. Not that it was any experience of abuse or anything that might be coded as really dramatically traumatic. But for me, it was a traumatic. I had some traumatic experiences growing up and some beliefs that were disempowering as a result of that. But I wasn't really willing to or wanted to or even thought about sharing any of that until I started really writing the book. With the 7 Rules of Achievement, it's not just about the rules. It's not just about how to do it. It's about someone who has done it and others who have done it and have come from relative obscurity or relative adversity. And some people certainly have come from greater adversity than I have and have made massive successes of themselves. And many of them have followed those rules, the same rules that I outlined in the 7 Rules of Achievement. So for me, it's just been a few years or so since I started sharing these experiences. And it goes back to early childhood. I'm an identical twin brother, and the very youngest of 6 kids, including my twin brother. And my mom was already 45 years old when she had us. So you can imagine, the first kid, I don't know if you're a parent, but for those parents out there, your first kid, you're sort of like, you're doting over them a little bit. You're watching out, you're taking care, you're not sure how you're supposed to do the thing, and you really kind of, you clench a little bit, By the second one, you loosen up a little bit. By the third, you know what I mean? By the 5th and 6th, which was my brother and I, my parents were like, hey, neighbors would come over to the house and say, your kids are hanging from the tree. We're 6 years old. We're hanging from the tree. We got each other tied by the wrist. We're pretending to be escaped convicts, right? We're hanging from a tree like 20 feet off the ground. The neighbor would come over and say, your kids are hanging from the trees, pouring rain out, the lightning out there. My mom would be like, she'd look at you, oh, they'll be fine. They'll be fine. So, we started to get really reckless and rambunctious early on. For that reason, my parents were fantastic, great parents, great values they gave us. They gave us everything we really needed. We didn't have a lot. We kind of came from a very lower middle class. We didn't have a great deal, but we had everything we needed. We didn't know we didn't have what many other people had. But we got kind of rambunctious, my brother and I. At some point, I guess it was about the 4th grade or so, we were both diagnosed with dyslexia and hyperactivity, which is like, hey, big deal. Almost every kid today is being prescribed Ritalin or some other kind of drug in that respect for ADD or something else. And this is kind of what we were experiencing. But at the time, the school system didn't really know what to do with us. We were disrupting class, we were fighting, so they tried separating us into 2 different classes. That didn't really work. So ultimately what they decided to do was to put us into the special ed program, the special ed class. And the special ed class was made up primarily of kids who really truly had difficulty, learning disabilities, or physical handicaps in some way. And it was really an interesting environment for me because it began to cultivate a belief. I never had this belief before this experience, but I began to believe, wait a minute, I'm stupid. I must be stupid. I can't read well. I can't write well. I write my name backwards. I'm in this class, in this environment. I'm the kid that shows up early for school in the little yellow bus, and I leave in a little yellow bus, which is, listen, as I said, it serves many children even today, but it certainly didn't serve me at the time because I developed some really disempowering beliefs around that. And as Freud said, we'll always manifest into our world or our life what it is that we believe about ourselves or the world. So if I believed that I was stupid, dumb, and not worthy, then that's what I started to manifest as the years progressed. As I got into high school, it started getting worse and worse. The fighting began to get even worse. I got my first Harley Davidson, was obtained illegally by somebody else who had obtained it illegally, and I was in 10th grade. And so I started riding my first Harley Davidson in 10th grade, and as you can imagine, there's not a lot of kids to ride with. You know, back in the, this was in the mid-'70s, and, you know, everyone had kind of Chevelles and Camaros and Mustangs, and muscle cars were the thing. I was the one riding around a big ape-hanger Harley Davidson chopper, you know? So I started looking for guys to ride with. I wanted to ride, because I still have this belief today, this philosophy, that there's only one thing that sounds better than a Harley. That is several Harleys. So I wanted to ride with several Harleys. So how I did that was I started riding through the streets of Manhattan, lower and upper Manhattan, and just looking for bars that had bikes parked out front. And the bars that I came across, of course, back then in the 70s and early 80s or so, you know, you didn't have a lot of the lawyers and attorneys and professionals riding Harleys. The guys that were riding Harleys in those days were outlaws or semi-outlaws or kind of dirtbag kind of guys, you know? So this is what I connected with. And I connected with an outlaw bike club. I can't mention the name at risk of life and limb, literally. And I started riding with them and connected. And for the next 5 years, that was my life. That was it.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting because I had like stints of small things that were considered accomplishments during those teen years where I struggled. It was sort of like a struggle back and forth between this belief that I'm not good enough, I'm stupid, I'm not worthy, to, you know, hey, I can do something here. I can accomplish something here. And I took on bodybuilding early on as a teenager and entered a few competitions. I actually did very well as a teen. Won the Teenage Eastern America, several of the Metropolitan Teenage events. But when it started to manifest into something that was identifiable as being a champion, as being worthy, that's when my unconscious mind said, wait a minute, that's not you. Shut it down. And I did. I started to shut it down. That's when the first Harley Davidson arrived or appeared. That's when I started riding with the guys, and it all ended for the next 5 years. That was it, man. That was my lifestyle.
Okay, that's pretty cool. I mean, obviously you've learned a lot from that. It's a great story, and what I want to do is I kind of want to dive into that a little bit just so we can build upon that layer to find out how you overcame these things and you're able to achieve what you've done today. So one of the questions that I had is I wanted to know, obviously, you know, you were riding motorcycles in high school and doing that. That was an outlet for you. But did you do any sports or have anything else that was an outlet for you besides maybe bodybuilding and the bikes?
Actually, I did. I studied martial arts. I'd been studying Chinese Kung Fu from, I guess I was about 8 years old, my brother and I. My older brother, Raymond, who was a police officer in Manhattan, saw that we were like starting to go in the wrong direction even as kids, you know, and decided to start teaching us Kung Fu because he was an instructor at the Chinese Kung Fu Wushu Academy in New York under Grandmaster Alan Lee, who I later studied with, and started teaching my brother and I. So for about 8 years or so, from about 8 years old to about 16, I studied Chinese Kung Fu, and it was, you know, it did provide a lot of discipline and some focus, and it also gave me some great street skills, I gotta tell you. You know what I mean? When you're riding with a bunch of outlaws, it's nice to know how to handle yourself out there on the street. So it really did come in handy. But unfortunately, I never truly embraced the full philosophy, the Chinese Kung Fu Buddhist philosophy, you know, which is sort of similar to the philosophy of Christ, which is turn the other cheek. You know, someone slapped me on my cheek. Sorry, man, you're getting bloody. That was it. That was my motto back then. There was no turning the other cheek. So I never really fully engaged in the philosophy, but rather just the art, the tools, the skills, you might say. Other than that, you know, I think part of it was I did do a little soccer. Never played football, never played basketball, never baseball, any of the top 4 sports. A little soccer, a little lacrosse, but never really excelled at those sports for some reason. And maybe it was the team thing. Maybe I don't know what it was. I can't really quite put my finger on it today even. But never excelled and kind of, again, sort of felt unaccomplished in those areas. I believe today, however, and this is something for our listeners to kind of be aware of too, is that what was taking place at that time was this thing that, you know, hey, you could be good. I know I was a good athlete. I was fantastic at Kung Fu, and I turned out to be a pretty damn good bodybuilder. And I could have been great at those other sports. But there was something in the back of my head saying, you can't do this. You're not good enough to do this. So I never excelled for that reason. And for a lot of, you know, listeners or viewers, we go through the same thing. You know, if you believe that you're a heavy person, if you believe you're not worthy of being fit, healthy, wealthy, whatever it is for you, that belief is the things that's driving your actions unconsciously. We don't know it. So you may not be, you know, sticking with your exercise program or sticking with your nutrition program simply as a result of some old disempowering belief that's keeping you from doing so. I've identified that over the years, and that's something we can get more into a little bit later on when we talk about the rules of achievement. But it was a critical factor in terms of why I didn't participate more in other sports as a kid and why I didn't really excel at the ones that I did participate in. Yeah.
If you didn't, you know, excel or really pursue those other sports, what was it about bodybuilding that drew you to it, and you know, you started doing that?
Good question. I think it's one of those. The only answer I can come up with is sort of like, you know, when you found that thing, you know, you just know it. It's sort of like it's dating. You know, you can go on 500 dates and I just haven't quite found the right person yet. And then boom, you're in a coffee shop, you're online. There's a woman in front of you or a guy in front of you. You just happen to chat with them a little bit, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, there's a spark. There's some magic there. And it turns out to be your soulmate. So for me, bodybuilding turned out to be my soulmate. And it was interesting, you know, because even, like I said early on, how I got into bodybuilding was, you know, I'd been studying the martial arts and really into that. And started to about 16, started to kind of get a little bored. I was still skinny. I was like this skinny Bruce Lee type. I wanted to get a little bit more muscle. And a buddy of mine showed up at my homeroom class one morning. And he's like, I got to show you this magazine, right? So he drags me like to his locker before, you know, I was always missing class and cutting class anyway, so it didn't matter if I was going to be late. So I go to his locker. He pulls out this magazine. It's an old copy of Muscle Builder, which is Muscle and Fitness Today. And on the cover was a black and white picture. The picture happened to be taken by a gentleman who I got to know later on named Artie Zeller. And it was a black and white of a guy, and he's got this like harness on his chest that's supporting his arms, and he's doing these curls, and veins popping out, I mean, shredded, ripped, muscular body, and a really cool looking, I mean, like the cool face, you know, the split in his teeth. I'm like, who is this guy? What is this, man? And I start flipping through the pages, and I'm like, oh my God. I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is freaking awesome. Turns out it was, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger on the cover. And, you know, hardly anybody knew who he was at the time. He was Mr. Universe. He was Mr. Olympia already at that time. He had still several Mr. Olympias to win after that. But I was so inspired just by those black and white pictures of those athletes, Franco Columbu, Frank Zane, Dave Draper, Bill Grant, you know, training at that Mecca, Gold's Gym out in Venice Beach, California. They were all black and white pictures in the magazine at the time. You know, we had color pictures, but these were all black and white. And it just added to the intensity because we kind of dreamed a little bit in black and white. So therefore it was kind of entering my unconscious the same way I would dream about it. And there was something about that said, boom. And the minute I picked up a barbell and started training, because my older brother recognized, who was teaching us the Kung Fu, recognized that we were dwindling in our passion for the arts. And said, why don't we do this for a little while? Why don't we take a break? We'll start lifting some weights, kind of build the muscle a little bit, get a little bit stronger, and then we'll come back to it. And we started lifting. So he was the first one to turn me on. When I touched that barbell, man, it was like electricity went off. It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And it just, bam, sparked. There was no going back after that.
So you were doing that. You were in high school. That was a big outlet for you. What was it all of a sudden that got you hooked on the choppers and the bikes? I mean, you talked about a little bit, well, you didn't really tell us how you got it, but what was there something that was a catalyst that got that going and got you into that?
Actually, it was, and it's interesting because I guess in evaluating or taking a look at the things that have really kind of sparked me, a lot of it is visual and then emotional. I see something that's like, wow, it sparks an emotion, and I remember very distinctly that it was I was in the back of our station wagon, and we were driving through Manhattan. My grandmother lived in Manhattan down in Gramercy Park. I mean, just this fabulous little area. My grandparents were very wealthy. We never saw any of it. And we were visiting them. And so we were driving through Manhattan, and it's a beautiful summer night. And all of a sudden I hear this like thunder. This thunder's kicking up. I sit up in the back seat, and I'm like, what the heck? All of a sudden I'm thinking it's going to rain. And we pull up to this light. Next thing I know, we're surrounded. Literally, I mean, it seemed like the entire Hell's Angel motorcycle club had pulled up next to us. And I looked out the window, I rolled down the window, I'm looking at these guys, choppers, the ape hangers. One guy had like this big scar across his face. He had this Viking helmet on with the big horns coming out of it, the chopper. And he looks over at me and winks at me, right? And I'm like, oh my God. And to me, with this, here I am, I'm this struggling kid with these disempowering beliefs about having any power, any strength, or even any intelligence for that matter. This was, I think it was about in 4th grade or so when I was first put in the special ed class. I saw that and I said, that's power, that's strength. I connected in my own mind, this is what I want to do. I want to be one of these guys. So from that day forward, I mean, literally every bicycle I ever had, we chopped out our bicycles, we cut off the handlebars from different bikes, and we attached them to the forks to chop out the front end. We painted them primer black. I mean, we just did everything we could to make these bikes badass. We even did cut-off vests. We had our little game, my brother and I, with about 5 or 6 other guys, were called the Savage Skulls. And this was in 5th grade, for crying out loud. We had combat boots on, the cut-off vest with the Savage Skulls painted on the back, and we're riding our chopper bicycle. So I think somewhere along the way, that model carried forward in terms of what is strength, what is power, what is brotherhood, what is camaraderie, and those are the things that we seek as young people. We seek community and connection. Mm-hmm. And there it was for me. So, that was a lot like the barbell, the electricity fired. I mean, that was it, man.
Okay, now you maybe not
willing
to go.
Was going back. There was some going back after that.
Okay.
It was a bit of a phase, man.
You may not be willing to go into, how you got your first bike, but I know that you paid for it a certain way.
I did.
I want to know how you paid for it. Tell everybody.
That's all the stories in the book. I can't even remember now, man.
No, just the short version. How you paid for it.
It was interesting because my first chopper was actually a Honda, and this one I had purchased legally. I was in 10th grade. It was my first chopper. It was a Honda, but it was on a rigid frame. It was an old 750. And it had this big chopped out, like eight, it was like crazy, 8 feet over chopper front end. But it was a Honda. And I already knew, even at that point, I was like, if I'm going to be even remotely cool, I got to have a Harley, right? But I didn't know how or when or how it was going to happen. And one day I got a knock on my door, and it was some kid who knew me from high school. I think he was in 9th or 10th grade himself. And he said, you're into bikes, right? I said, yeah. He goes, well, I've got a bike. I've got a motorcycle. And he shared this story with me. Now, to this day, it's sort of like, oh, my God. I can't even imagine even remotely thinking about entertaining what I did then. But he had shared the story with me that his neighbor's son, who owned this chopper motorcycle, had died, several years before. And the motorcycle had been sitting in the garage for about 4 or 5 years or so. And he stole it. He stole it out of the garage, and he buried it in, we had this woods not far from my house called the Three Streams. And he buried it in the woods. He covered it up with dirt and bushes and the whole bit. And he took me over to see it. I said, well, let's go see the thing. And so he uncovers it, and I immediately recognize it. I'm like, oh, my God, that's a panhead, which is like, one of the most sought-after Harley-Davidson choppers, it's pan. It was like from the 60s. It was so outdated, the style of the bike, but it didn't matter. It was a Harley, right? So I asked him how much he wanted for it. He wanted $500 for it. So I said, all right, let me think about it. That night, my brother and I got on our stealth black gear, and we went into the woods. We unburied the thing, and we brought it home. The kid came to my door the next day. He's like, "The bike is gone, and you're the only one I showed it to. You had to take it, man. Why'd you take it?" And I said, "I tell you what, man. I'm not saying I took it. I'm not saying I didn't take it, but I'll give you $50 and a case of beer, and we call it even." And he's like, "I don't know if I can do that." I said, "How about this? I don't kick your ass." I know, it's awful. It's terrible.
Oh, that's great, though. That's a good story.
Yeah. He didn't get his bike kicked. He got his case of beer. He got his $50, and I got my first Harley Davidson chopper. And part of that bike, that truly really got me introduced to the Outlaw Bike Club friends that I developed along the way, the comrades, you might say. Yeah. Because, the bike was illegal. So we had to get numbers stamped in it. We had to get papers, and you don't do that going through legal, avenue. So I had to get connected. In order to make that bike rideable, you might say. Okay. And from there, and I got to tell you, just admittedly, openly, it was a thrill. The entire experience was a thrill. It was like, wow, this is freaking adrenaline. It was cool. It was just like, man, getting that bike out of the woods, negotiating that deal, getting hooked up with the wrong people to get the stuff done for the bike, and then riding with them afterwards. It was an adrenaline rush, man, and it's very, very addicting, And so, like sports, some people get it from the sports because they believe in themselves and they believe in their ability to exceed. I didn't, so I got it somewhere else along the way.
Okay, so once you got into these, the groups and the outlaw groups, what was life like for you? And kind of like, what was the groups like?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question, honestly. It's interesting because the group of guys that I had started riding with were already insiders. They were inside the club, and they were cool guys. Most of them much older than me, much older. I mean, not even in their 20s, in their 30s and 40s. And I began to see that, it wasn't just a brotherhood. It wasn't just a camaraderie. It wasn't just, strength and connection. And it certainly wasn't about the motorcycles. Not by a long shot. The motorcycles become a bit of a backdrop in this scenario. And what it becomes about is an outlaw lifestyle and whatever it takes to support that outlaw lifestyle. And admittedly, and I'm very proud of this, by the way, there's not a lot that I'm proud of during that period of time, but I'm very proud that I never got involved in some of the fundraising opportunities that many of my brothers got involved with, which of course was drug dealing, prostitution, gun, things of this nature, and never ever got involved in that. I did have some dear friends, even friends that I went to high school with, who saw once I was connected with the clubs and started riding, that also connected. Many of them prospected and became full patch members and got involved in those different illegal money raising ventures. And most of my friends today from that era are either dead or in prison. I have one very dear friend who lives in Florida today, who is one of my best friends in high school, who full patched and rode with the club, still rides with the club today, still does it. And it's amazing to me when I talk to him. I'm like, it's like unbelievable that just almost 25 years he's still doing it, man. Wow. But he loves it. That's his lifestyle. That's what he does. And interestingly enough, he was also one of the only people who supported my exit. He said to me, "Tom," he goes, "you're better than this, man." He goes, "You should be doing more than this." He goes, "You got to get out. You got to make this decision and go." Nobody else supported me on that. Nobody else wanted me to. Nobody else wanted to look at themselves in the mirror and say, "You know what? He's doing something more. I should be doing something more." Nobody wants to look at themselves in the mirror and do that, especially when you're doing drugs and alcohol and you're living that lifestyle. It means radical change. It takes an effort. So it's interesting that he's still there, but he was the only one that supported my exit. And the exit was a pretty interesting story. I don't know if we have time for it, but
yeah, right. I want to get to that quickly, but before we do, I want to know what it is that was keeping you in. I mean, your friends telling you you're better than this. Get out. You can do so much more with your life. But what was it that kept you in?
I loved it. It was the power. I love the motorcycles. I personally, I love, if I get pulled over by the cops back then, and again, please understand, when we hear people say I'm a changed person, most of the time we unconsciously don't believe it.
Right.
Once of this, once of that, always of that. Not true. You can make a decision. We've seen it happen countless times. People radically change their lives. I'm a totally different person. At that time, I loved running from the cops on my motorcycle. Loved it. Try and catch me, man. I had only a rear brake. I had no front brakes. This thing could have killed me at any time. I'd gone down several times on the bike. But if I got pulled over, half the time I didn't have a registration. I never had a motorcycle license. It was probably a warrant out for my arrest for one thing or another at any given time. And if I got pulled over, boom, I'd wait till the cop got right up next to me, and boom, I'd go. Gone. And I loved that kind of stuff, man, back then. It was the adrenaline rush. I loved hanging with the badasses. I loved fighting. I was fighting 3-4 nights a week. I was in a huge brawl, always. And bouncing at the clubs was a rush. And so for a while, for that 5-year period, it was just one of those things. I was living this lifestyle that I imagined in my mind when I saw those bikers pull up against our car in Manhattan at that time. That was the lifestyle I was living. But what happened was it started to take a turn in the wrong direction. It started to get ugly. And at that point, it wasn't living this sort of imagined fantasy biker lifestyle anymore. It started to go in a different direction. But during that period of time, I'll be honest with you, I couldn't put my finger on what the glue was that kept me in it the whole time, other than the thrill of the ride, man. The thrill of the ride with the guys, the thrill of the fight, the thrill of the alcohol, even the drugs. Just the whole thing was a huge rush, man.
I know you've also said that riding with them was a way for you to hide a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is something I talked about a little bit earlier. When we have negative or disempowering beliefs about ourselves. By the way, we all do. I've perfected a technique to determine whether you have disempowering beliefs, and that is just simply to look in the mirror. And if you look in the mirror and you see a human being looking back, you've got some disempowering beliefs that you can change. And when you change those beliefs, everything will change along the way, because the beliefs, are based on our values, and they're what drive our actions, as I said, either unconsciously or consciously. So at the time, I had these disempowering beliefs about myself, that I wasn't good enough, I wasn't worthy. I could not, at that time, picture myself in any way, shape, or form fitting in with normal society. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't fit in with school. School was the model of normal society. I didn't see myself like the other students. I had been put into this special class. That means I became, and as the biker community calls it, a 1%er. You're 1% of 1%. And that's the outlaw. And for me, being in that special ed class, that was 1% of 1% of the rest of the student population. So I was already an outcast in many respects. So I started to believe these things. Number one, I'm not good enough. And number two, I'm already an outcast. I can't fit in normal society. I can't. So how was I going to go from not fitting into the normal society of the educational system to all of a sudden, wow, I'm just going to put on a suit and tie and just get out into the normal world and get a regular job, So it was either be an outlaw or work at frickin' McDonald's. And it wasn't going to happen that way. So, for me at the time, it was hiding from full potential. Because even though I had this belief, and for many of our listeners and viewers, you may have this belief about yourself that limits you right here, when the truth is you have unlimited potential. But we hide from that potential in what we're doing. We get busy, we get lost, we get engulfed in what it is that we're doing now that keeps us from fully exploring or tapping into that potential. For me, I already knew as a bodybuilder, as a teen bodybuilder, I did pretty damn well. I won some really great shows. I was excelling. There's a very dear friend of mine, John Defendez, who's Mr. USA today. You can connect with him on Facebook. John Defendez, great guy. He still talks to this day about how I beat him at the Teenage Metropolitan Championship, and he was a great freaking bodybuilder, Yeah. But it was shortly after that it ended, because, like I said, it was like all of a sudden the beliefs. All of a sudden the reality started to not be congruent or not match the belief. The belief, not good enough, not, and certainly not a champion by any means. And all of a sudden, wait a minute, you're becoming a champion. The magazines are paying attention. So I started to hide from that. I started to run from that instead of embracing it. And for many of us, we do that. We get immersed in, I've got this great job. It's nice. It pays me good. I know I'm not really tapping into my potential. I'm not being all I can be. But you know what? I still got to pay the mortgage, my home. And we do that for years and years and years until we get to be mature adults and we wind up regretting not having made that change, not having taken that risk. So for me, you're absolutely right, Eric. I was hiding. I was hiding from my true potential. And it was a great place to hide, by the way. No one looks there. The only one that looks there are the federal agents and the police.
Right, right. The people you don't want looking there.
Absolutely. I didn't want them to find me. Kid, you got great potential. We're going to lock you up for 5 years.
Yeah. All right, so explain
a
the story on how you got out of there, how you got out of this crazy outlaw biker world.
Man, this was a story that even to this day, when I share it, it sort of invokes a certain emotion because of the impact that it had. But I will share it, and happy to do so. I was at the clubhouse one night, which we were, 4 or 5 nights a week, and the clubhouse was nothing more than a warehouse, with a rickety old handmade bar made out of a couple of 2x4s and some plywood held together with duct tape, some banners and some posters hung up, the club name bannered all over the place, and a bunch of kegs of beer and some weed, and that was the clubhouse, and I was hanging out there, and I was leaning against the bar. And I remember very distinctly this particular night, something was going on in my mind, and maybe it was something that was already starting to manifest in terms of some thoughts of change that was taking place. But I started looking around, literally looking around, and I'm thinking to myself, this is what I'm becoming or have become, and I didn't like what I saw. And again, no put down to anyone who's living this lifestyle, including my dearest friend down in Florida. But I began to see from a different perspective, from a different point of view, this entire world that I was immersed in, and I didn't like what I saw. And I started to even evaluate it further, and I started to see that a lot of the guys that were in the club were, in their 50s or 60s, if they made it that far, and they looked like they were in their 60s, limping around with their canes, the big beards, and and I was like, man. And at that very moment, literally a voice entered my consciousness. And I don't know if it came from, I have an idea where it came from, but I don't know if it came from my unconsciousness or if it was, a higher source, if it was God that came in, and I became aware that it said, "You're done, walk away." And it was like, what? I mean, literally, it was like somebody whispering it in my ear. So I literally turned and looked. And I heard it for the second time. And I tell you, the second time I heard it, I must have looked like, a boxer laid out on the mat and waking up to the referee saying, 9, 10, you're out. I was like, what? Who? And there was no one talking to me. But it was the voice was so firm, not demanding, not commanding, not harsh, but so firm that I had no choice. I had to listen. I had to listen to that voice. And it said, "You're done. Walk away." So I did. And as I'm walking away, I literally pushed away from the bar. I didn't finish my beer. And as I'm walking away from the bar, someone tried to stop me, a very good friend of mine, a gal that I grew up with in high school, who had married one of the club members. She wanted me to stop and have a drink with her. She said, "Come on, let me buy you a glass of, whatever it was. We were drinking Jack Daniels or something at the time." And I said, "No, I'm done." And as I walked away, I was almost at the door when I turned around just for a moment. And I had that fleeting thing, you ever have that experience where you've made a decision, you're going to make a change, that's it, you've already started to take action, but then you look back just for a moment, and this is going to cost you, there's going to be some price to be paid, and usually, when we make a change, there's a price to be paid. We're going to have to leave something behind, we're going to have to pay a consequence, we're going to have to suffer in some way in order to make that change stick, and that's the test that we're given. Because if it was easy, everyone would just change things that they don't want in their lives, or things that they need to change. So I knew at that moment as I looked back, and as I did look back, what must have happened was someone must have shoved against the bar. And it was, as I said, this rickety old bar. Someone must have shoved against it. And on the shelf behind the bar was a loaded double-barrel shotgun that had been cocked and ready to go. And as they hit the bar, the shotgun must have fell off, hit the ground, and both barrels went off and went through the bar in the very spot that I had vacated just 2-3 seconds earlier. A huge hole. Boom. Glass, shotgun pellets, wood, just completely engulfed like a swarm of angry bees. The whole perimeter. The entire place just exploded. No one knew what happened. People, they got their guns out. No one knew if someone had come into the place and is starting to shoot. I was frozen. I was absolutely frozen. All I could do was look at that hole in that bar, and I knew that was the exact spot that I had walked away from just a moment ago. And I knew if I hadn't walked away from that bar at that moment, then life would be radically different, or maybe life would be over. It would be done. My choices would have been very limited, let's put it that way, or maybe I'd have no choices at all. So it solidified the decision. Not everybody's decision is solidified as dramatically.
Right.
But I walked away from that bar. I walked out of that bar and never, ever looked back. The first stop was the gym, getting back in shape. And I'll never forget that experience. It solidified in my mind, you made the right choice. You had to walk away at that moment. And I've always tried to listen to that inner voice, and knowing the difference between that little inner voice that's really trying to protect us, like driving, if you've ever driven down the road, on a rainy night, and you're doing a little fast, you're going about 70 miles an hour, and you don't realize you're going as fast, and it's a little slick, it's a little dangerous. That little inner voice will pop in your head and say, slow down, hold on, slow down here, this is a little dangerous. You got to know when to listen to that voice versus the voice when you've made that decision to move forward, make a change, and you're about to take action on it, and that other voice comes in and says, wait a minute, you remember the last time you tried to do that? You're going to get hurt. You're going to lose all your money. You're going to get your heart broken. Don't frickin' do it. Same voice. It's the same unconscious. But we got to know when to recognize the difference between when it's really trying to save our lives or support us, or trying to keep us from moving forward because it's afraid of change. So for me, I've tried to learn from that experience in terms of which one to listen to. And it's been very powerful ever since.
Very interesting story, and a lot that people can pull from this. Now, what I want to know is, you left this world that you knew. You were so closely involved for 5 years. You got back into the bodybuilding. What were you doing for money? How were you feeding yourself?
At that time?
Yeah.
You mean like before? Like
no,
when I got
after the biker stuff.
The first answer is I got a job at a gym. I mean, because I had this little bit of a background. I knew how to train. I had very, very good mentorship early on, even during those teen years of massive confusion. The reasons I was able to excel as a teen bodybuilder, even through those doubts and uncertainties and disempowering beliefs, was because of the mentorship that I had. I had two gentlemen that I had worked with back then. One was named Tony Pandolfo, and Tony was an extraordinary bodybuilder in his own right. He won the Masters Mr. America not long ago. All the top East Coast championships in the lightweight division. He was a small guy, about 5'5", owned the gym called Future Man, which is where I used to train back in that day. And tremendous leader, tremendous mentor for me. Taught me everything I knew about training and nutrition, and just really led me down the right path as a teenager. He led me away from the anabolic steroid use as a teen, which a lot of guys were doing even back then. So his mentorship meant a great deal to me. Unfortunately, he passed away just about a month or so ago, which was heartbreaking for me. But the reason I bring that up is because I had learned some real skills about training. So I took those to an athletic club. And the very first gym that I worked at was actually at Jack LaLanne's. It was before Bally's had purchased Jack LaLanne facilities, and this was in Long Island, New York. So I was making minimum wage, working 10 hours a day, training people, mopping floors, cleaning toilets, whatever I had to do,
Right.
Just kind of be around it, because I knew if I was going to leave this, I needed to fill that void, that adrenaline void. I needed to fill that void of focus and brotherhood and camaraderie, and I knew that was available in the gym environment, in the bodybuilding world, because I had experienced it already. So I did whatever I had to do. So one gym job evolved into another. Ultimately, I started doing a lot of personal training. And I started personal training at a facility in Manhattan. So I wound up back in New York at a place called Definitions. And I met one of my all-time worst, all-time best training partners at that facility. But that was really how I made a living. That's was just being involved in the gym. Yeah.
Okay, and you were training, you were doing the bodybuilding, were doing the competitions at the same time?
I was. In fact, it took me, after I left the biker community, it took me a few years, obviously, to start to rebuild the body. But I started competing again on a smaller level. One of the competitions that I really set my sight on, which was which had been won by several real great champions who later on became Mr. America, including John Defendez. I mentioned him earlier. He had won it, the New York Metropolitan Championship, which was the biggest, most sought-after, prestigious bodybuilding competition at that time in that metropolitan area in New York. It was like winning the Mr. California. It was a big deal, you know. So I set my sights on that, and it was about 2 years after leaving the community of really hard discipline training, nutrition, diet, I mean, just really immersing myself in it, that I was able to win because I'd won it as a teenager earlier on, so I was able to win the overall Metropolitan Championship. Then I competed in step up. I always strategized in terms of how I was going to do it. Starting with a smaller competition, next rung up. I never wanted to, because I set my sights on winning the Mr. America. I knew right off the top I wanted to win the Mr. America when I got back into it. And so I didn't want to just keep competing at the same level. And a lot of guys do that, and I think they cut themselves. It's sort of like hiding in that biker world. You're hiding at the same level for too long, and you're doing nothing but collecting trophies. It's time to step up and take a risk. Yeah, you're winning here, and you may only place 5th here, maybe even 6th here, but now you know next year, boom, top 3. The year after that, boom, I'm going to win that contest. And you always kind of step up the ladder. And for me, it was about taking on greater and greater levels of challenges every single time. Till ultimately, I got my first shot at the national championship, and I was very fortunate to have taken 3rd place in that in New Orleans. So it was really exciting to do that. But yeah, I was competing at the time.
Okay, and so you were doing the training for these other guys, but did you have a business where you were doing this on your own?
Not yet. Okay. Not yet. In fact, I was not an independent trainer. Okay. Right up to the point where I won the national championship, the Mr. America, I didn't have my own business. I was always working for someone else at that time.
Okay.
After winning the nationals, the decision was made, this is what I want to do. I want to continue in the athletic club business. I'm going to open my own facility. It seems like a no-brainer, you know?
Right.
Of course, I got slapped in the face a little bit, because you go from being, you're a champion bodybuilder, and great technician, as a fantastic trainer. At that point, I'd become sort of this New York celebrity trainer. I was training with clients like Regis Philbin and Eddie Fee and Gregory Hines and some really great people, and had sort of developed this status, you might say, which is not all that great. I got to tell you, it's getting paid by these people is pretty difficult. I got to be honest with you. I had to hire some club members to go chase them down for a check.
Call your biker buddies up.
Exactly. It really did elevate the prestige of my ability to train people at that highest level. Mm-hmm. And so after that, I made a decision that I was going to open up the athletic club. But going from being a great technician and a champion bodybuilder doesn't necessarily lend itself to being a great business person.
Right.
I was very fortunate, and I kind of recognized that, and I partnered with someone who had been one of my clients and became a very dear friend, who was an extraordinary business person. And so together we built several athletic clubs in New York, in Long Island specifically, called Maximum Health and Fitness, and those really, number one, they were very successful, but number two, they sustained me in terms of my ability to really immerse myself in the bodybuilding world, particularly as a professional competing for the Mr. Olympia title. So that was great.
And once you had those businesses up, how long did you, the ones on Long Island, how long did you have that open for?
Well, we stayed in business until I made the decision to move to Colorado. So we opened our first one, I guess it was in 1986. After winning the national championship, we opened the first one. We opened the second one the year later, the third the year after that. And I think it was about 5 years that we had those athletic clubs.
Okay.
And at the time, I was, and it's interesting because one of the things I teach is focus, really focus on what you're doing. And at the time, I was like kind of a little all over the place. I was a professional bodybuilder, athletic club owner, and I was also doing television with Fox Sports Net.
Yeah.
At the time, I was asked right after doing the Nationals to co-produce and host a show called Muscle Sport USA. And it was an event-oriented show where we would cover all the top events in the country, mostly amateur events, some professional. So I was kind of doing all these things, and it's good. They were all in the same genre, but you kind of get, it's kind of all over the place a little.
Right.
We did. The television show lasted for 16 years. The athletic clubs, I think, was about 5 or 6 years or so that we had. And then when the television show had brought me, that's one of the reasons I brought it up, had brought me to Colorado, we were covering the Colorado State Bodybuilding and Fitness Championship. And when I got here, which is where I am now in Denver, Colorado, when I got here, we arrived in Boulder. And if you've never been to Boulder, Colorado, it is just so cool. It's a really artsy college town, and it's right off the foothills. We call them the Flatirons. So you've got these really cool rocky Flatirons if you've ever been here. And, of course, the further backdrop are the Rockies themselves, which is extraordinary. And coming from Long Island, the beach is cool, the water is awesome, but these mountains, man, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. On top of that, I met the gal that weekend that I was out here to cover the event, who's now my wife. So we fell in love. I mean, literally, it was one of those things where it was like the barbell.
Yep.
I saw her, boom, that was it. I was done. I fell in love here. This place isn't bad. Yeah. And so moved out to Colorado. I think it was in '91, and made a decision to sell all the athletic clubs and just make the move, make the change. That was it. Yeah.